We're so glad you're back. This is Trinity Place in Geneva, New York, on the 16th Sunday of Pentecost. Greetings, welcome back to Trinity Place in Geneva, New York. My name is Cameron Miller, and this is a sermon for the 16th Sunday of Pentecost. The two readings that I'm going to look at here are from Genesis 50, 15 through 21. It's the part of the Joseph story in which, toward the end, Joseph grants mercy to his brothers who had betrayed him and sold him off into slavery. And then the other one is Matthew 18, 21 through 35, which is begins with Peter asking Jesus if somebody offends him, how many times does he have to forgive him? And Jesus says 77 times, basically. So those are the two readings. So this sermon is really kind of forgiveness number 2 because of last week, but this one is about mercy and forgiveness. And it's a sermon that probably, if you've been listening here, heard dozens of times before from me. It has elements that may be new, but other elements that sound like same old, same old. But it's also a little complicated too. You see, we have two topics that seem as though they're the same, but which are very different: mercy and forgiveness. Joseph gives mercy to his brothers, and Jesus urges the practice of forgiveness to his friends. Mercy and forgiveness seem like Siamese twins, but truly they are not identical. They're not even fraternal twins. In fact, they are two different categories of relationship and healing. Starting with Joseph, these big, fat Old Testament stories have some juicy little morsels in them, but they are almost accidental to the grand narrative. Sometimes when we read the Hebrew text, we get overly interested in the subplots, but it's the bigger story that's more important. If we get caught up in the detail, it may cause us to kind of focus on a little current somewhere and miss the surf coming in. But with Matthew and the Gospels, it's just the opposite. Matthew's story is a simple little parable that was turned into something much bigger and more complex, and our objective is to kind of dig in and find the little bits of ore. So I'll start with Matthew and the familiar reminder that I always make about parables. Jesus and the other itinerant rabbis of his generation taught with parables. Parables were pithy little stories with one simple point aimed at like a tip of a spear to get stuck in the brains of their audience. The story we heard from Matthew today has a parable hidden in it somewhere. But in the telling of it, it was passed down over a couple generations before Matthew put it into writing. The simple little parable with a single point morphed into a complex allegory. Now, the point of Matthew's allegory is that God is like a king who forgives his slave of an impossible debt. Then, in the complexity of the story, the king discovers the very slave whose debt was forgiven did not model the king's generosity. Instead, the slave had a fellow slave in prison and tortured because he owed him money. Now that sounds counterproductive, but in those brutal days, they tortured debtors to find out if they were hiding any money anywhere. It was a pretty grim system. So in Matthew's allegory, God is the king who forgives our impossibly huge debts. The slave is us if we do not forgive those who trespass against us. A slave's punishment will be our punishment, as the allegory goes, with each character and event reflecting the promise and the threat of our relationship with God. We too will be thrown away and tortured if we behave badly, presumably in hell and fire. According to Matthew's allegory, God's forgiveness is conditional and completely dependent upon our forgiving others. That kind of logic and conditionality makes sense if we believe that God is a cosmic judge or a stern parent with a big, horrendous paddle in the hand. But to me, such a God sounds suspiciously human rather than the God and the creator of the cosmos. But don't take my word for it. Think about Jesus. He was a populist teacher and revolutionary, talking to peasants who were brutally oppressed. If we keep that miserable social context in mind, it's hard to imagine Jesus saying, well, you know, God is like a king who threatens imprisonment and tortures those who don't do what he says. For peasants living under the Roman Empire and abused by their local corrupt tyrants, Matthew's description of God is just more of the same. Who needs a punitive tyrant running the cosmos when that's what they have running their lives now? Underneath these stories, we will see that a truly powerful God exercises mercy more than forgiveness. By contrasting Joseph with the Jesus parable hidden inside of Matthew, we'll see something very interesting about mercy and forgiveness. Now, in Joseph's day, and still in Jesus's too, there was a culture of blood libel. We hear the commandment, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and we think it's primitive and vengeful. But in its time and place, it was radically progressive. You see, the role of an eye for an eye indicated to the ancients that if you kill my little brother, I don't have the right to bring my clan over to your village and wipe the whole village out. Retribution had to be proportional. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. So taken in its context, an eye for an eye was an improvement over blood libel. As a law and a custom, an eye for an eye reigned in unrestrained brutality and violence that were natural in blood feuds. But Jesus takes an eye for an eye teaching and refines it with the parable we can imagine is hiding underneath Matthew's allegory. Jesus declares that mercy is a higher value than vengeance. Mercy, in fact, replaces even measured retribution as the core value for Jesus' community. We hear that and we think, well, duh. But our own institutions of law and governance still don't grant supremacy to mercy. Jesus was preaching forgiveness as a radical strategy that would free the minds of brutalized peasants from the toxic consequences of bitterness and resentment, the kind of thing that I was talking about last week. But here I feel the need to make a caveat that I hope I made before, because it's one thing for Jesus to preach a strategy of forgiveness to his peers, and a totally different thing for institutional religion to preach the same thing at marginalized people. Why? Because the church as an institution preaching forgiveness has more often than not been a tool of oppression. Christianity as an institution begins as a tool of Caesar to inflict unity and require conformity. And the Roman Catholic Church becomes an inquisition inflicting horrid violence on its world. And the Anglican Church becomes a partner in British colonialism to rape indigenous cultures that they colonized. And the Episcopal Church tagged along with the U.S. government to convert the leftovers of Native American genocide and then became major perpetrators of violence and abuse. It's a very different thing for powerful institutions to insist that their victims forgive and forget and show mercy than what Jesus was doing when he was talking with his peers. Only those with the power to execute punishment have the ability to show mercy. Victims cannot show mercy toward their abuser unless the power arrangement has been reversed. Herein lies the difference between forgiveness and mercy. While forgiveness is something all people can practice, mercy is something that implies a power differential. Mercy is a gift granted from one person who possesses the power to give it to another person who does not have the power to grant mercy for themselves. But as I said last week, forgiveness is not a gift. Victims of oppression can practice forgiveness, but when they do, it's not on behalf of the perpetrator, nor is forgiveness a gift to the perpetrator. Forgiveness is a strategy to free the heart and the mind of the one who has wounded or abused it. Forgiveness is a strategy for those who have been transgressed against so that they can move forward without the corrosive effects of resentment that only does injury to themselves. Jesus does not suggest we give anything away when urging us to forgive. Rather, he's recommending a strategy for healing. Forgiveness, as Jesus teaches it, is not a moral achievement, but rather a protocol for one's own healing and recovery. Forgiveness is not an ethical principle or a test of moral purity. It is a tactical maneuver in spiritual warfare. As we read about forgiveness and mercy in the Bible, we need always to remember the context. Joseph could show mercy to his brothers only because he had power. He exemplified forgiveness earlier in his life when he used it to free himself of the bitterness and the hatred toward those brothers who betrayed him. But later on, he was powerful and he could grant mercy. And perhaps he did so because he had already practiced forgiveness. Likewise, Peter asked Jesus, how many times does he have to forgive some jerk in the community and Jesus answers 77 times. What he's really saying is, well, how long do you want to suffer under the effects of resentment and bitterness? Peter is asking Jesus for a rule, and Jesus gives him a functional strategy for living. How much acid do you want in your heart? But again, forgiveness is not a rule or a commandment. It's a strategy for healing and a weapon of spiritual warfare. Unlike mercy, forgiveness is not something that we give to someone else. It is something that we do for ourselves. But mercy is something we give or do not give when we have the power to do so. These are complicated stories about complex realities found in the tangled jungle of our own hearts and minds. Two stories in a poem will not begin to unravel them. So that's all I got for now. Except to invite you to receive and to give forgiveness. Thanks for your listening. Well, all right, Lisa.